Hello, students. Make sure I get your names down. All right. See here. All right. Hello, Arena. Let's see here. So, Ryan. Um, so as I'm writing down these names, do I have any comments or questions or anything that I need to be familiar with or apprised of? All right. So you guys are doing the life under the Articles of Confederation. Technically our nation's first government, right? Post independence. And getting into this, notice that I I really do try to keep myself up to date regarding any new, newly popular or thought provoking thesis regarding a given subject, right? I mean, that's what kind of demonstrates the subjective part of history is that virtually any topic you choose, especially when it comes to causation, right? What caused something to happen? You're going to inevitably have disagreements amongst those who are out there in discourse and writing their books and giving lecture circuits, etc. Right? Okay, so I have all seven of your names. All right. Um, so at any rate, but with the Articles of Confederation, it to me it lacks that variety. It lacks that debate. Sorry about that. It lacks that historiographical complexity and divisiveness that I think is healthy for academia and healthy for history and healthy for students and teachers. And so sometimes, I'm still looking. And I'm sure it's out there. It just hasn't gotten a lot of attention as far as anything beyond the common narratives of the um, of the Articles of Confederation. So let me give you some of those narratives. Okay, a few of them. And like I said, you're going to find them. Oh, thank you very much. Irina, I appreciate that. I'm so happy to be feeling better and to be back on the saddle. I can't even begin to articulate that. Um, I love my job and I love working with you guys, with students, and I'm very happy to be back. So thank you for that comment. Um, so for one, right, is you get the common narrative that events of the well, do I want to do that first? Maybe not. Okay. Let me go another route. Okay, if you don't mind first. Uh, One is known as the Beard thesis, Charles Beard, right? Like a man's beard, Beard, right? Charles Beard emphasized the fact that big money, right? Those connected to big business, commercial farming, the big mercantile or merchant guys, right? The creditors, those who lent money, right, as bakers or lenders for a living, that they were not doing well under the Articles of Confederation. So his is an economic interpretation, right, to this time period. And Charles Beard wants us to look at how the fact, right, it's kind of Marxist history of how those with with a lot of economic clout, with a lot of economic power and influence and resources, and of course, with primarily a selfishly economic motive, right, behind their actions, that they were not doing well under the Articles of Confederation. That the Articles of Confederation was too loose, it was too decentralized, it was too chaotic, there was not enough economic planning. There was not enough subsidization, right? The government subsidizing or helping out businesses. And so hence they had a vested interest, right? They had an economic interest to devise a government that was more centrally um, compacted, was more centrally powerful, right? Again, primarily for economic reasons, right? And so that's the Beard thesis, Charles Beard. And that you find that a lot in narratives, right? When you look at the quote, the alleged chaos of the Confederacy, and you look at the conservatives who wanted to change that, right, and formulate the government that we have today, which is more heavily centralized into the federal or central government, and and arguably is less democratic. But the government, clearly, the central government, is better equipped than it was under the Articles of Confederation to help promote, subsidize big business. Okay. So you have that. And then kind of the political side to that very similar argument is you have the argument that in particular Shays' rebellion, Daniel Shays, right? Shays, or Daniel Shay, um, Shays' rebellion, right? That to conservatives like George Washington, it scared the heck out of them, and it convinced them that we need to have a more centralized, right, powerful, centralized government, less democratic government, right, but not necessarily or primarily for the economic interest of business, right? But for the maintenance of of the social structure, to maintain the domination, the security, the property, right, of the well-to-do, because it seemed like a radical move from below this Daniel Shay rebellion. All right, and with Daniel Shay's rebellion, right? Kind of in a nutshell, this happened in more states than in Massachusetts, but to many Americans in these Confederate states, right? They were the legislators were passing laws to help facilitate access to land as well as um, credit, right? Borrowing, right? To the common civilian of their states. We'll get into more about that in a moment. As far as underlying foundational stuff about that. But for now, right, that was happening, and so they were trying to get Pennsylvania, New York, and Virginia to cede or to let go of their claims to the Western and Northern territories that were not part of the 13 colonies nor Articles of Confederation, but were ceded to the new United States. We weren't United States yet, obviously, by Great Britain. They were wanting those three states to cede that territory, and there was pressure to put forth a policy, a general policy of acquiring that land for everyone in all the states. And it culminated in the famous Northwest Ordinance, okay, of 1787. But there were laws in 81, 84, 85, and then 87 that tried to have a system whereby that Native American territory could be parceled out and sold and offered at an available, cheap, affordable price to the average common citizen of any of the 13 colonies or states. Then also with credit, right? Each state was in some ways virtually autonomous or independent. They at any given time, on average, 5 to 7 states of the 13 were issuing their own currency, even though the Continental Congress and later Articles of Confederation, even though that Congress had its own standard currency, 5 to 7 were nevertheless printing their own currency system. So things were a bit economically chaotic. And within those states, right, what they began to do is, especially in states where the avenue to the American dream, it seems like numerically was most often found through commercial or cash crop farming. trying to farm, to produce, cultivate a given cash crop and sell it at the market for profit, right? And so, you have um, indigo and rice and tobacco and cotton down in the south. You had primarily wheat, up in the north. And so when you get these commodities, right, um, to this day, I mean, there was no crop insurance. There was no subsidizing from the government at that point and so forth. So you were on your own, like the name implies, right? An entrepreneur, someone who starts and risks a business. You were running a lot of risks trying to begin your farming operation and pursuing your American dream, right? So you start off, it takes money to make money. You need capital, right? You need money to play with. You need to be able to purchase the land, get the seed and tools, perhaps hire laborers to help you cultivate it. Uh, and go through the consumption and the time necessary for the cultivating process long before the crop finally comes in and you finally sell it at some market and be able and are able to make a profit, right? And receive income. So you got to sit on and spend money up till that point, right? Deferred gratification. And so, as with virtually any business, so the farmers, right, in a couple seasons in particular, things went awfully. They went awry for them with weather, etc., and with depressed prices as far as supply and demand in the cities and markets, right? So these farmers began losing money and they're unable to pay on their loans. Well, there's a long history in Western civilization tradition whereby you are to put up collateral, right? You are to promise your assets, the wealth of what you own in property and objects, right? And goods. You are to put that up as a promise that you are going to pay back your loan. And if not, they could begin taking from your collateral. So it was no different back then, in some cases more severe. And then also ultimately you could even from our inheritance of English common law, you could even go to debtor's jail for defaulting on your loans. So what was happening is state after state, as in Massachusetts, the popularly elected legislator would show mercy and grant leniency and help out the common aspiring farmer and businessman who was unable at the time to pay back his or her loan. And they called them stay laws, for instance, right? So with the stay laws and others, right, they would grant them and buy them extra time to pay back their creditors. And in some more extreme cases, is they issued something, kind of similar to modern day bankruptcy laws so that you could somehow hold on to your collateral and receive one more second chance or start, if you will, right? And default and officially default and paying back your lenders, your creditors. So at any rate, when this happened, needless to say, that has economically harmful consequences. You can't continue to do that indefinitely and not expect a very, damaging economic domino effect to ensue. And so, for one, right, creditors, lenders, they began retracting on money that is owed them. They began going to judges, right, and trying to sue in court to get the collateral from those who had defaulted in paying back their loans to them. They take their money and they lend it elsewhere. Certain states develop bad reputations for not paying back their loans. And so creditors wanted nothing to do with those territories. So, at any rate, with Shays' Rebellion, is they had produced, the popularly elected legislator of Massachusetts had produced on more than one occasion stay laws. And then finally, the legislator stood its ground and said, no, no more. You have to pay your loans back or suffer the consequences. And so when those consequences began to ensue, there were a couple counties in particular in Western Massachusetts, right? Uh, to which uh, a kind of caravan of judges moved by horse carriage out to those counties, those western counties, right, uh, to um, to adjudicate, to put law, to put into session court cases to decide upon the consequences of that. So as they came into a couple counties in particular, they set up camp. They presided in the local townhouse meeting building, right? And they began to call on individual farmers and businessmen to be held accountable for their debts. And of course, they were to be stripped of their collateral, and in more severe cases, to be put into debtor's jail, right? So as this is happening, a guy named Daniel Shea and others, right? They would not stand for it, and they literally came into the courthouse and threatened violence upon the judges, right? And remember, the English for the longest time are very proud of their tradition of diplomacy, compromise, incremental change, right? Organic, slow change and evolution, not tumultuous revolutions or coups, right? Or violence of any sort. And of course, they have their exceptions, the English Civil War of 42 to 49 in the 1600s, etc. But with the English tradition, right, they're very proud of this. And so, with us having inherited this, right, and our conservatives being proud of their English heritage, they were horrified at this. They're like, okay, wait a minute. These you know, lenders lent of their own accord, had multiple chances to pay their debts back. Then finally, when they were held accountable for defaulting on their loans, and the age old tradition of confiscating their collateral and in some cases putting them briefly into debtor's jail ensued, they threatened violence upon the judges. And so, and that included George Washington, who was horrified and disgusted by Daniel Shays' rebellion. So they threatened to kill the judges. They came in and forcefully took the debtors out of jail, quote, liberated or freed them. And then when the state legislator and governors had had enough and began to bring in troops to secure law and order, they devised a standing army to actually fight battles against their own state militia. So to the conservatives, right? They wanted a stronger government that could command and draft boys from all 13 states, that could ensure that the rule of law prevailed and was not disrupted by armed ruffians, right? And defiant rebels. And so that's also kind of part of the Beard thesis. Again, is that clearly conservatives did not like having such a decentralized and democratic confederacy that we had during the war and for 4 years after the war, from 1783 to 1787. Okay, so then speaking of conservatives, right, is the conservatives are going to eventually prevail in in their desires and their intentions, right? As we know historically, that a couple conventions were established, one in Annapolis, Maryland, and the second bigger one was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, whereby they're going to scrap this confederation and they're going to devise a much more highly centralized, a less democratic republic, constitutional federal republic that we have till this day, right? And so we know the conservatives are going to eventually, somewhat have their way. But, how did it happen? And so a standard thesis included in this, popular dialogue on this subject is that the liberals were silenced into submission by how awfully everything went, right? That they almost had to concede, they almost had to admit that no, they were not the Republicans. Actually, the Democratic Republicans were actually the liberals, but that the Federalists, the conservatives, uh, had a case in point, had some merit to their argument that too much democracy and too decentralized of a government can be and were, in the case of the U.S., harmful. Okay, So, what are your objectives? The type of government that you devise is clearly going to be predicated by certain, priorities and objectives that those who are ruling have, right? Well, of course, according to American political tradition, one overweening, commonly embraced objective, whether you were on the left or the right on the political spectrum, was prevention of tyranny, right? You did not want any individual, any group of individuals, any political body, any political position or figure to strip American people, citizens, of their rights and of their liberties, right? So a fear of tyranny is commonly found when you look at like Bernard Bailyn's history of the U.S. War for Independence, right? And we talked about that. The Scottish libertarians who said, don't trust big government, that there is something inherent in human nature, kind of like the Lord of the Rings type phenomenon, whereby people cannot handle too much power. That if you gave too much power to virtually any human being, he or she would eventually try or succeed in becoming a tyrant. That there's something insatiable about power, that man can never have enough of it when it's offered to him. And so, that was part of the Scottish Enlightenment and the Scottish liberal tradition uh, up through the War for Independence. Um, you know, uh, a sense of balance. Again, going to a guy named Montesquieu uh, of the French Enlightenment, and he wrote a book translated as The Spirit of the Laws. And he wrote how any given faction, any given an individual in government will, if given the opportunity, become tyrannical. And so, hence, there has to be a sense of balance and counterbalance and weight and counterweight, right? Between different factions. Remember, a faction is a group of people that share the same self-interest and or the same ideology, right? And so that any given faction can and should not be trusted, would become a tyrant if you let that faction be such, and would just, kind of throw its weight around and pursue its own interest and its own agenda, possibly and very likely at the expense of everyone else and other factions, right? So you want a government that tries to prevent tyranny from any given group, individual, et cetera, right? And so when you look at the Articles of Confederation, you see clearly um, fear of a centralized, um, aristocratic flavor of tyranny. So the centralized part, that's self-evident, right? And what I mean by that, um, a body of people, an individual who has excessive power over a rather large jurisdiction, political jurisdiction. So, for instance, up and through and during the War for Independence, there was a great fear of governors, as you saw with Governor Hutchinson of Massachusetts, Governor Dunmore of Virginia. They really threw their weight around as British governors in trying to squash this quote patriotic cause, right? So what do you know? Pennsylvania and it might have been just Pennsylvania did away with the governor position entirely because they didn't want the possible tyranny of one chief executive over their state, right? um, at least two colonies did not trust an upper branch or upper body of the legislator that passes laws in their states, right, in their proper states. And so, hence, they only wanted what was equivalent to the House of the assemblies, right, the voice of the people, those directly elected by citizens of the state to directly represent their people, their constituency. And so two states did not have an upper house. They only had a lower house, popularly elected house that passed all the laws, right? Those who did have governors largely circumscribed their power to only be able to veto legislation and make certain appointments of certain positions in their bureaucracy. Uh, Compared to English political tradition, governors had been much stronger than that in the past. They were able to shut down legislators and tell them that they had to disband and could not meet. They could refuse the acceptance of someone who had been rightfully elected into office, but they contended was, a source of conflict and revolution, like John Wilkes back in England, who was elected by his constituency. And King George III and the consecutive Tory party of Parliament said, nope, we don't care he was elected. He's not welcome to Parliament. So, governors, as like the king writ small, the king at a smaller level, right? They had much more power, and they were stripped of a lot of that during the Articles of Confederation, right? So you have that phenomenon, and then also, they deliberately created a centralized legislator and government that in some ways was toothless. It was powerless. And that's exactly what they wanted. They would rather err on the side of being too weak than too strong, because they had seen, supposedly, and they had read about and been warned about during the War for Independence, what would happen with a central government that was too strong. And of course, it would become the bully over the states and over the people, to their fears, right? So the Congress, it did not have coercive tax power. So hence, they would ask the states, they would formally request each state, right, for a certain allotment of tax revenue, and the state got to decide if they wanted to provide that. If there were a rebellion, right, under this confederation, and there was a need for soldiers, they still had to formally request or ask or petition each state for a certain number of soldiers to help squash that rebellion. And there were a couple rebellions like Little Turtle and Pontiac, in particular amongst Native Americans in the Ohio Valley during the Confederation days. So at any rate, oftentimes the states did not give the Congress what it desired and what it claimed that it needed. There was no president. There was no chief executive over the Articles of Confederation. They wanted it that way. They wanted no chief executive that could smack of anything like a monarch or a king or queen, right? And so hence you just had key committees under the Articles of Confederation that prevailed. And there's a guy named Arthur St. Clair and others who presided over those committees. And some say that was the closest thing they had to a president. And to a lot of historians, that was a stretch, even saying that no, we did not have a president, period, much less a king. And so, see, everything was intended to be weak like this, right? Because we were supposedly caught up in the spirit of that age. We were caught up in the propaganda and the rhetoric of the quote revolution, right? And we were in no mood to tolerate tyranny from a chief executive, from an elite group of an upper house, right? And from a federal government outside our state. Because, by the way, right, with the influence of libertarianism, right? Government don't tread on me. Government is a necessary evil, and you want to keep it as small and weak and unobtrusive into your personal life and my personal life as possible. To the libertarians, it was taken as an axiom, right? An assumption that you don't even question, that as a lesser evil, government ought to be, right, the following. For one, it ought to be it ought to err on the side of democracy, right? So the idea of Aristotle's categories, right? A tyrannical monarch, right? Threatening your liberties and freedoms and rights, right? Or an elite cadre of a few people who call themselves the best, so hence an aristocracy, right? Or the majority masses of the demos, in Greek, the people, right? Democracy ruled by the people. That you would rather err on the side of a democracy, right? And remember, to the conservatives, they disagreed, like John Adams, right? And others. John Adams and conservatives said the majority of people can and often have been in history just as tyrannical as the few could and have ever been, but not to a libertarian. To the libertarians, right, at least in their rhetoric, like Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, they would rather take their chances at the mercy of the majority of people than they would under a small cadre of aristocratic men and especially under one powerful monarch or executive, right? President or king or queen as an individual. And so, hence, to them, right, they wanted to err on the side of too much democracy, if not anything else, as a lesser evil, right? They also wanted government to be, as I already mentioned, too weak rather than too small. We've already talked about that. And they also wanted government to be, right, more localized than distant and centrally located. So to them, right, um, the idea was, again, as government being a lesser evil and looking for the lesser evil. And of course, to libertarians, what's the ultimate fear is tyranny. That's the main thing they're trying to avoid, right? And so, to a libertarian of that time period, they thought it's better for people's power to be locally based, right? To be here in the Modesto area rather than located centrally in Washington, D.C., outside of Baltimore, Maryland, 3,000 miles across the country, right? Because, for one, um, people under libertarian thought, right, are easily become out of touch and lose a sense of why they were supposed to rule, lose a sense of what life is like for their common constituents. So if you put them at a distant locale, they will more easily, more quickly, right, lose touch with what things are like in their area. And so, hence, all the more reason to keep them local and apprised and constantly aware and familiar with what the people are going through, what the conditions are like amongst their constituency. Secondly, right, the idea is that half jokingly, the people know where you live. When you are more locally, ensconced in your own home and amongst your constituents, there's a higher sense of accountability, right? And as you saw, like with the Stamp Act riots, etc., is that people went literally to Governor Hutchinson's mansion. They went to the chief tax collector's house and pillaged their homes, threatened their lives, lit their houses on fire, stole their furniture, etc. Right? And so, to libertarians, that's another reason why you would rather government to be localized, so that the people would literally be and will feel more accountable to their constituents. Right? And then lastly, right, you want it more localized because if it stays localized, the resources are smaller and fewer, right? And remember the whole, kind of Lord of the Rings joke that people can't handle too much power, right? Um, the further distant they are geographically, according to libertarian thought, right? The larger and more states that are, and larger the area that encompasses one centralized government, the more resources that possible tyrant has access to. And he could develop a larger army, a standing army, to turn it on his own people, right? More wealth and resources, right? More connections with more factions, and become more and more dangerous to the common people. So the idea was to keep him local, because then his bureaucracy will be smaller, right? The guys that carry out his day to day, living and of the functioning of the government, his militia, the number of soldiers he has at his command, all of that will be smaller if you keep it localized. So that's the idea, right? Under the Articles of Confederation, is America was in a very, quote, for lack of a better way of saying it, enlightened and liberal mood, if you will, right? And they would rather err on the side of being too democratic, too decentralized, than the opposite. So what happens, right? According to a popular narrative that has really, to me is pretty old, and I look forward to more, theses that challenge it, but it has survived, for a reason. There's a lot of data to support it, obviously, but the thesis is, right, that the very fears about government that are being too democratic and too weak and decentralized, right? Those fears, um, materialized during the Articles of Confederation, right? That the people carried out and behaved themselves, the leaders and those governed, in such a way that lived up to the negative stigmas, the negative stereotypes about that type of government. And what it did is it gave ammunition to the conservatives, right? Who could tell the liberal leaders, right? Especially those liberal leaders, many of whom had a college education and had read their history, had read their Aristotle and Plato critiques of democracy, right? They had read about what history and these different figures had criticized democratic and Confederate governments for. And the conservatives could tell the liberals, right? See, I told you so. I told you, history should have told you that this is exactly what would happen, right? Be careful for what you ask for because you just might get it. And so, hence, right, with democracy, you look at Aristotle, right? And he contended that, the majority of people will be led by their appetite, right? I think of like Freud, the id, the ID, right? Your base instinctive self-interest, right? Your aggressive desire to just pursue whatever your five senses want without regard for what is legal, what is ethical or moral, right? What is fair or unfair, that almost beast like, almost like an animal or a toddler child, right? You just follow that base instinct for self enrichment, self interest at the expense of everyone and everything around you. And so, to Aristotle and other critics of democracy, they think that democracy encourages that monster within the common person, and that the common person ought to have no um, opportunities to run government, is not intellectually capable, is not morally responsible enough to be trusted with the reins of government. And then you look at your Roman history, and a lot of, I think of like Tacitus, Cicero, um, Livy, and Suetonius, these other writers, right? They would contend that Rome was only free and free from tyranny, right? And somewhat democratic when Rome could handle it and its people were responsible. And it's the notion, right, of civic virtue that George Washington adhered to. Is the idea, right, is that the country is safest, our liberties are best protected when the common citizen is self-controlled, is selfless, has concern primarily, first and foremost, for what is best for the republic itself, and not for him or herself selfishly as an individual, right? And so that when you look under Roman history, you have times in which, like, perhaps, not to throw these gentlemen under the bus, because evidently it's more complex than this, but like the Gracchus brothers of Rome, Gracchus, the Gracchus brothers and other periods of Roman history, right? The popularly elected tribunes, the voice of the common people, the common Roman citizens of the empire, or before the empire, the Rome's Republic, right? That they wanted to pander to their voters, and their voters were following their id, their appetite, and they selfishly wanted to enrich themselves and felt envy of the patricians, the wealthy aristocrats of Rome. So they wanted to strip the patricians of their power. They wanted to strip the patricians of their land, right? Literally, ideas about like land redistribution, etc. And they envied and wanted to take the place, right? And emulate and take over the lifestyle of the well-to-do. And in doing so, right, it kind of created a domino effect of civil war in Rome between the rich and the poor. And when you look at the Articles of Confederation, in particular, when you look at Daniel Shay's rebellion, you find some semblance of that, right? Whereby it seems like the popularly elected legislator of Massachusetts just simply pandered, gave whatever the people wanted, right? in return for their votes. And what they wanted, they hadn't thought, about the repercussions of what they wanted. They didn't think, arguably, about the ethics of how it affects their lenders, right? Their creditors to whom they owed this money, and the state economy itself. But they were only thinking about themselves, arguably, in episodes like Daniel Shay's rebellion. So to George Washington and the conservatives, right? They thought, see, Daniel Shay's rebellion is a case in point. Uh, there is such a thing as too much democracy, and there is such a thing as government being too weak. As much as they in libertarian fashion feared big government over anything, they felt as if they'd gone too far on to the other side of the spectrum, right? Like with the French Revolution, they would say to the left, to differentiate from historical tradition, right? That they'd gone too far to the left. So hence, Thomas Jefferson, he went to France when they began deliberating changing this democratic Articles of Confederation. He literally went to France. He left the country, and did not join the fight as a libertarian liberal to maintain this confederacy, right? And we have quotes from him in his correspondence, etc., that suggest that he wasn't crazy about changing it, not even desirous so much, but that he felt like it was inevitable, it was unavoidable, that the liberals had their chance and they abused it. They took advantage of it. And the way by which a confederacy looked poorly, right? So we went into how, too much democracy uh, can be harmful. We looked into the historical arguments of that and how events in the Articles of Confederation seem to play into that stereotype, that negative stereotype of democracy, like with Daniel Shay's rebellion. And with the Confederation, it deliberately being so decentralized and weak, Spain and England absolutely defied laws that were part of the Paris Treaty, that were to grant us, uh, uh, certain commercial rights, access to certain rivers. Sorry about that. Gosh. At any rate, right? You have that notion that that when you look at the Scandinavian countries in history, when you look at the Italian city states during the Renaissance era, they oftentimes were fighting with one another. They did not properly unite when they needed to militarily, right? And so, hence, you could make the historical argument that confederations have not worked too well as far as yielding practically beneficial results, that they arguably can be too weak, right? And so, hence, you find evidence that you could point to during our Articles of Confederation. Um, New York and New Jersey having commercial wars against one another that were not economically beneficial for virtually anybody in the long run, but almost, to the point of petty, of taxing one another's products and making it difficult for one another's merchants to enter across the state line to the other state and do business. You had, like I mentioned, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, almost go to war with one another over Western and Ohio Valley territory that they were claiming simultaneously, right? And they would fight amongst one another about that. You had problems in the Confederate Congress of some saying we need to deal with the Article of Confederation's debt, and just for one thing, right, the fact that it owed foreign creditors in Europe millions of dollars, and it owed its own Continental Army soldiers, right? That they had promised them lands in the Ohio Valley, as well as stipends of money, of payments, right? For an allotment of time. And so different states were absolutely overt about it. They didn't even try to hide it. They said basically, well, that's not our problem. That's the Confederation's problem. That's not Maryland's problem. And so, good luck. You're not getting our help. And, to make a change to their government, to strengthen it by way of an amendment, required all 13 states' approval, unanimous approval, which of course was virtually impossible, right? And so, in case after case, That's what you're looking at with number one on this week's handout, is the idea that in practicing much more democratic state governments, right, and practicing a deliberately weak and decentralized confederation as a form of united government, that the people behaved selfishly in such a way that it played right into the negative stereotypes of democracy and of having a confederacy, right? So that the conservatives played right into their hands, and they could tell the liberals like Jefferson, who became kind of silenced, right? See, I told you, right? And so when you see when it really counted, as far as them going to Philadelphia in May of 1787 and devising a new constitution for a completely new government, when you look at the conventions to ratify or approve it in each of the 13 states, yes, you see a lot of tumultuous fighting and arguing and passionate debate and power struggles for sure, right? But you still see, right, the fact that it was able to I don't know if I would say easily, but it was able to be approved by 9 of the 13 states, right? So enough of the libertarians, the liberals of that time period, the Patrick Henrys and Thomas Jeffersons, right? Enough of them. Uh, the argument is they could have put up a stronger fight against this new centralized government, but they didn't, because arguably they felt like Jefferson, that it was a losing battle. And more subjective and difficult to prove is the argument that they deep down felt like the conservatives were at least partially correct, that the people did kind of mess up their chance to have a democratic and decentralized government, and hence it might be, a necessary evil to devise a less democratic, more centrally strong and located government. So as you see, right, with the Constitution, which we're going to get into next week, um, you have coercive power over legislation and taxation. Now it doesn't matter if your congressional rep says no to a tax, says no to a law. If a majority of the congressional reps say yes to it, then it is imposed in your district, whether you and your rep wanted it or not, right? We just take that to be, an axiom. Of course, that's the case, right? It was not the case back during the Confederation. We have a chief executive, right? A president with power to command the army, to veto legislation by the national legislator, right? To appoint a cabinet, et cetera, et cetera. So we clearly went a more conservative route with our president. And then, of course, we have a national Supreme Court of unelected, hand-picked men and women, a small group, right? Chosen for life. That clearly was a conservative turn from our Confederation. And then lastly, what I would mention is Article 1, Section 8, that is a list of things that the new Congress can do. And most things on that list, the federal Congress could not do under the Confederacy. So clearly, the founding fathers, when they met in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, uh, they devised a more centrally powerful government, right? And arguably a less democratic government. Okay. Not a one house legislator, but a two house, with the senators not being popularly elected initially, right? Nothing about universal citizenship for all human beings, nothing even close to that found in the Constitution. So, at any rate, they clearly, right, took a more conservative route in 1787. So much so that some of the liberals, right, decried that our revolution had been betrayed, that under the spirit of 1776, we were all about libertarian thought, enlightenment thought, liberal thought, right? But by the 11 years later, by 1787, we had decided on a less democratic, much more powerful, much more centralized government. Okay. So something to think about. And regarding that, you look at a woman named Pauline Meyer on the second number. And Pauline Meyer contends that kind of what we've been talking about, that the conservative founding fathers, right, those who were at the Constitutional Convention and signed this less democratic, more centralized republic, right, that they clearly had conservative designs in forming our new and current government, but they did not completely get away with their agenda, right? To her, she almost solely focuses on the ratification process, right? And the idea was, right, is that the founding fathers, kind of like a you writing your own essay and then you yourself grading your own essay, right, or proofreading it. That's what the founding fathers arguably metaphorically wanted to do, is they wrote the Constitution in the summer of 1787, and they themselves, the same group, wanted to approve it. Well, state after state, according to Pauline Meyer's book entitled Ratification, right? State after state put up a good fight against this, right? So some, as you might guess, said, no, it is on principle. Even if we agree with every component to this new constitution, on principle, we want to give our approval to it, right? So a handful of states actually flirted with the idea, and a couple eventually did flirt with idea and began to implement a popular approval process, right? Known as the referendum, where you literally give the vote out to the people themselves, to the citizens at least themselves, and let them popularly decide yes or no, whether they approve or not of this new republic under this new constitution. Other states, however, like Massachusetts, didn't go to that extreme of to the left of democratic change. But what they did do is they a lot of them sent in uninvited guests, right? So when the states, when the founding fathers left Philadelphia and went back to their own states, they tried to form amongst one another their own constitutional conventions to ratify it. Well, like I said, in some cases, the people used the press, the people used the masses and mobs of people who showed up to the conventions themselves, right, in large numbers, and they used, intimidation and applied pressure upon the founding fathers, where some of them said, okay, fine, we'll have a general election so that you could elect whomever you want to decide on ratification or no approval of this new constitution. But again, in Massachusetts, going back to them, is small little towns, Ipswich and Braintree, Massachusetts, etc. Right? They got together at their own village and town level, elected their own reps, sent them as uninvited guests to these ratification conventions, right, in Boston, etc., and made the demands on behalf of their people and said, you know what, we're not okay with this new constitution unless, and they would have a list of demands or grievances, right, that they would bring with them. And one chief common example that is used by Pauline Meyer in her book, as far as popular pressure put upon the founding fathers, is the Bill of Rights, the first 10 or technically 9 amendments, right? Guaranteeing human rights, individual freedoms for all citizens. That was an amalgamation, a putting together combination of demands made by these constituents of the states, saying we will not approve of this new republic until or unless you grant us the following. And they would specify what specific right they wanted guaranteed and written down in the Constitution for the citizens therein. So when you look at the amendments, you look at the First Amendment, right? The freedom to protest peacefully, the right of religion, the freedom of the press, right? The freedom of expression. You look at the due process amendments, which constitute at least 3 of the first 9 amendments, right? And saying that you have a right to, well, I don't want to get into specifics because you're going to get into that next week. But the point being, right, is, according to Pauline Maier, she depicts the founding fathers in a very, by today's standards of egalitarianism, a very negative light, that they had their own agenda, they were selfish, they wanted their own enrichment and power, they wanted, for their own selfish reasons, a less democratic and more highly centralized government, right? But only when the people, during the ratification process, the approval process, threw their weight as common Americans and made demands upon these founding fathers at the different state levels, right? That because of that only do we have some of the liberal, some of the enlightened, right? Some of the democratic components to the Constitution that we are proud of to this very day. All right. So, are there any questions? Because I technically I've introduced, right, the topic of the Confederation and the turning to the republic that we have today, and I have covered the arguments or theses. Thank you, Jessica. To numbers 1 and 2, and you only have 2 numbers on this week's assignment. All right. So before we call it a week, we call it a day, we call it a Zoom meeting and video. Are there any last minute questions, concerns, anything, to which I need to be aware?
So I have a question.
Sure.
I know you've been sick, so I know I understand. But I've kind of been freaking out about my homework, whether or not I'm on the right path or, like I've been checking. I know that I'm just afraid that I don't know, my homework, I'm concerned.
No
I'm on
problem.
the right.
I'll tell you what, Jessica, you will, let me write this down. Let's see here. I am making a note.
I've been wondering the same thing.
Sure.
It's
Sure.
like, am I totally on point or am I totally off? Right?
No, exactly. And I'm so sorry. So,
It's okay.
yeah, I am making a note because, it's kind of arbitrary. I don't want to play favorites. But amongst my 4 classes at 2 schools, I began with 2 other classes and getting just 1 assignment done from each of them the last couple days. I will hit your class's assignments next. I promise. All right. So I'll make yours my next class.
Thank you.
No problem. And in addition to that, especially with you voicing your concern, like I said, at a certain point, for the sake of expediency, and because I'm looking at so many assignments, I eventually will just start giving, oftentimes, just points, and then telling you to go ahead and Canvas message me if you have a question as to why I gave you a 48 out of 50 and not a 50 out of 50. But for right now, especially the way this semester has gone and my absence there for at least 2 weeks, I am going to be sure to write in the column of the discussion column of comments. Okay. On the next at least couple that I do for you, I will write. I'll write precisely what I think you're doing right, or what I would specifically like to see a little differently. Okay, to communicate that to make sure that we're on the same page.
Thank you.
No, you're very welcome. That's the least I can do.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Karen. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. Thank you, Allison. And so, okay, guys. So if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and call it a day, call it a week. Notice also, I believe I just did. I'm posting the second test. I may not let you have unlimited submissions anymore, but I would still like to let you look at that test itself weeks ahead of time, and feel amply prepared and knowledgeable of what will be thrown at you. You're welcome, Ryan. Thank you. All right. So thank you, Oz. So you guys have a great week, okay? Have a great day. I believe I finally caught up on the Canvas messages. So by all means, that's my primary, kind of engine that I look to and use as far as in addition to Canvas announcements to communicate with you. So by all means, throw me a Canvas message if you have anything on your mind, any questions or concerns, okay? So you guys have a great week, okay? And I plan to see you next week. And I planned anything at all you need to communicate. I plan to hear from you by way of Canvas message. All right. Thank you
Thank you.
guys. Thank you. I appreciate you.